All right, greetings everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna dispense with trying to figure out who's in what time zone, so I'll just say hi to everyone. Welcome to the last session on the last day. Always the fun place to be for IETF meetings. This is Dprive. I'm Brian, and my illustrious co-chair Tim is riding shotgun. Uh, the agenda for today is going to be fairly light on different topics, but we're going to have an in-depth discussion of one particular topic. Before we get started, we want to go through and just make sure everyone remembers that there is the note well that we all have to operate under. So, if you're bored of listening to me stand here and run my mouth, you can go off and read all these BCPs and make sure you understand everything that is required of you as a participant in the IETF. I'm sure most of you know that we don't have to sign blue sheets while we're doing all this virtually. That information will be collected automatically from MeetEcho. So the agenda for today, we're going to do any check for agenda updates. We'll do a quick document status on 7626, and then we'll go through and do essentially the three active documents that we're currently focused on. Zone transfer over DOT, DNS over quick, and then we'll have a longer working session to start trying to hammer out some of the details that go into the phase 2 requirements document. Does anybody have any proposed changes, updates, additions, deletions, what have you to the agenda? Paul.
So there's been a lot of active discussion in the last 2 weeks, not on the phase 2 requirements, but on things that relate to phase 2. So I'm hoping that last bullet point where you say phase 2 requirements actually can encompass some of the things that we've been talking about, specifically how some of the mechanisms that would come out would relate to each other, would relate to things like DNS hop and such.
Okay. And yes, Paul, the goal here is to really try and iron out where those relationships might exist, and that can be part of the open discussion as well, is what we want to try and get out of this. Any other comments on the agenda? Okay, so just a quick update on 7626 biz. There is a discuss. Tim and I have been talking about how to respond to it and working through the details of that response, and hopefully we're going to get something out in that inevitable real soon time.
Today. Sorry, I've just had to page the whole thing back into my head before I write that email on the GenArt review. So I was going to do that after this meeting.
Excellent.
So there you go. Sorry about that, folks.
All right, so moving on. So we're gonna have a couple of quick talks to do an update on the zone transfers and DNS over quick. So I'm going to turn things over to Sarah, who I believe is going to be doing the presentation, and I'll drive this. You got that? You ready to go, Sarah?
Just let me, if you can hear me, that is.
I can hear you.
Okay, what I need to do is share my screen, which it is not very happy with me doing. Come on. Actually, do you want to drive the slides? Because
yes, I can do that.
Yeah, thank you. If you could do that, that'd be cool. Okay, thanks. Right, so I'm going to talk about the ZOT draft, that's zone transfer over TLS. One thing I would appreciate, if it's possible, is to get a bit of feedback about how many people have actually read the O3 version of this draft. One of the reasons for that is that we have had no comments to date on this version on the list. So just so I can understand where to pitch this presentation. And in a quick discussion with the chairs, it seemed that if people who'd read it could just do a +1 in the chat, that might be the simplest and quickest thing. It just will give us context for people's comments. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So what is ZOT? It's essentially using TLS as a transport to do zone transfers. And the major use case for this is confidentiality. It's in order to protect the contents of the zone from passive surveillance. There's also implications in terms of authentication and also in terms of TCP performance that we discuss in the draft. Next slide, please. So in essence, what we're doing is we're proposing that in the existing RxFR mechanism, all the XFR requests and responses must be encrypted in ZOT. Next slide, please. In other words, everything in the red box has to go over TLS. That's a must. Next slide, please. And we're proposing that the SOAs do as well, just to minimize the data leakage. Next slide, please. So the current status is that the draft itself was adopted in November of last year by the working group. We had an O2 version out that we presented at IETF 108. We got a lot of feedback during that presentation, particularly on the proposed use of ALPN for this mechanism, which it was clear in reviewing those comments did not have consensus. So we produced an O3 version of the draft in October this year. We hope that we have incorporated all the feedback that we got back on the O2 version. I'll run over some details in the next few slides quickly. We think we've addressed most of the open questions that are in the draft. There's only a couple left. And so what we're looking for today is some feedback on whether the working group feels that the document is now going in the right direction and that we can start pushing it towards a working group last call. Next slide, please. So a very quick overview of what the current version of the draft contains. We introduced some new terminology. So we generically talk about XFR over TCP to describe the two mechanisms that work over that transport. We use ZOT for transfers over TLS, and we differentiate iZOT RxFRs and AZOT, just because there are some very small differences between how they get treated. The main structure of the draft is that we start by talking about the use cases and the threat model. We touch on the existing XFR mechanisms and some of their limitations and specifics on the data leakage. We now have a significant section where we talk about updates to the existing specifications. I'll go over that. We then talk about the ZOT specification in detail, and then we touch on a couple of other topics, authentication mechanisms and group transfer policies. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things we were asked about last time was to clarify the threat model, and we've done that. And what we've made clear is that the scope is very fixed in terms of what this mechanism is trying to do. We're not trying to obfuscate that a zone exists or that two entities are engaging in zone transfers. We're just trying to protect the actual content of a specific transfer, and that's the limits of the goals of this mechanism. As I mentioned, we've beefed up the section on updates to existing specs, because a lot of the feedback we got was that it was much more useful to have this done in one place. It also made much more sense in looking at getting consistent implementations, good interop, and also clearly not requiring new implementations of ZOT to support any of the legacy behavior that has hung around. So this draft now updates both 1995 and 5936, but really what we're doing here is we're making explicit all the implicit requirements that are there because of RFC 7766, which is the draft that basically says how we should be doing TCP in DNS. So the main two things are to say we should be using persistent connections, we can use keep alive to manage the idle timeouts, clients should be pipeline queries, responses can be intermingled, we can use the same connection for IXFR and AXFR. So it's just explicitly clarifying these things in the context of the TCP transfers. And we have a very small update to 7766 to make sure that the concurrency of connections is treated identically for TCP and TLS. We noticed a small discrepancy when we got back to do this. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other things that have changed in the section on the ZOT specification are that we're now clearer on how the authentication of the two ends will work. So clients must authenticate servers and servers must authenticate clients. In other words, the two ends of the connection must be happy that they're talking directly to the other entity. And there's a later section that gives the rationale for which mechanisms we're using here, and that's been modified again based on feedback. Having removed ALPN, we've now introduced a discussion section about how the TLS connection handling can be done by the primary. The main case we want to address here is concerns for authoritative servers that want to do ZOT and therefore need to listen on TLS, but really only want to engage in zone transfers with a tiny set of their transfer partners for the zone, rather than receiving connections from a wider client population. So we make clear that just because you're doing ZOT, it doesn't mean you're doing any form of ADOT. We have a section on how you can use extended error codes to refuse any traffic on a TLS connection that you are not willing to answer. And what we do in an appendix is we outline some of the options around operational and policy decisions about how a authoritative operator could choose to handle these incoming TLS connections. And we basically just enumerate the possibilities and try and outline the pros and cons. And that's now as far as this draft goes. Next slide, please. So the remaining questions in the current text are really just around the specifics of the use of extended error codes. So at the moment, for the case where a server chooses to refuse traffic on a TLS connection, we're proposing in the draft that you use not supported. There's a possibility of using prohibited instead. We'd like feedback on that, or whether or not this is a specific enough case we should create a new error code to deal with it. Similarly, there's a case where Bind in particular at the moment has a quota on the number of concurrent XFRs. If it exceeds that, it will serve fail. And we could also think about adding a specific extended error code to signal that if it's thought useful, so that it could potentially have something like a back off for the clients. So again, feedback on that, please. A small update to the implementation section that's in the O3 draft. We have a patch that we are about to submit to NSD where it will do reuse by default. That's not its current implementation, but it's actually quite a small delta to switch it over to doing that. We are working on a patch to add ZOT capability to NSD when it's acting as a secondary. We've been testing against NSD itself and against a TLS proxy. And this week I was actually able to pull down the latest developmental bind code, which has very early support for vanilla server-side DOT. There's no explicit ZOT support in bind yet, but I was able to get zone transfers happening between patched NSD and bind, which was brilliant. Thank you, bind people. And so I think we're moving towards a stage where if there are other implementers interested on working on this, we can start doing some proper interop. Next slide, please. So at this point, we really have one request. Next slide, please. and that's reviews. Please, can we have some detailed reviews? Feedback today, obviously, and detailed reviews on the list so that we can push this forward. Thank you. That's the end of the presentation. So questions, please.
Alex.
Thank you, Sarah. I will review that. I'm just wondering, how do you want to receive suggestions back? Is there a GitHub for that draft, or do you want them as comments on the list?
There is a GitHub, so either. I mean, perhaps that's a question for the chairs in terms of general mechanisms within Dprive. I probably prefer on the mailing list because I think it gains a bit more visibility, but also happy to take issues in GitHub. And I'm just checking the draft to see if we put the GitHub link in the draft, which I don't believe we did.
Well,
so I can send that out to the list though.
And any other question to that, Sarah, is the GitHub repo set up to reflect that feedback via GitHub back to the mailing list?
No, probably not.
Then comments to the mailing list.
Yeah, the bigger issues to the mailing list. If it's editorial type stuff, I figure it can just go through the repo, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, spelling stuff, you know, grammar, you know, random small stuff like that. So, okay, Puneet.
So I must admit, I haven't read the draft unless other than the quick scan right now. So the question may already be answered. So you mentioned that there are some, basically there may be connections on port 853, which are trying to do regular auth queries, which you may want to reject if the server doesn't support it. I'm wondering if it makes sense at this point in time to just say that XFR is a different enough operation that it should be on a different port by default, and then we don't have to deal with regular queries and XFR operations happening on the same channel?
I'm not sure that's really warranted at the moment. I mean, if the group wants to go down that route, of course, we'll look at it, but it's not historically how XFRs are managed in TCP. The existing drafts explicitly allow mixing traffic on connections. The ALPN was an attempt to sort of argue that this was special protected traffic, and a lot of folks said they didn't like imposing that distinction at the moment. One of the things we suggest in the draft is that, of course, authoritative operators are free to use different IP addresses for their XFRs, and then they can impose response policies on a different IP address. So not the published, they can refuse all XFRs on the published IP address of the name server, and they can hand out a dedicated IP to just the members of their transfer group, and that then gets used for zone transfers, and that's something that's already done operationally. So it seems like there are enough other alternatives that at the moment it doesn't feel like it warrants its own port, but I'd be interested to see comments on the list on that.
Thanks, sir.
Anyone else? Definitely give it some review. There's been a lot of changes since 02, a lot of good, it looks like, but I think we're getting pretty close to working group last call. So that's why we want to sort of get folks to do the due diligence and give some feedback.
All right, thank you, Sarah.
All right, thank you.
Jim, do you want to speak up? now that you jumped in at the last minute?
A quick question for you. Are you going to set a deadline for review comments?
We probably will. And I would say, based on the holidays, et cetera, we should be looking at working group last call by the beginning of the year.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
All right, Christian, are you ready to go?
Can you show up the slides, please?
Yep.
I can.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is a presentation. I mean, it's an update on DNS over Quick and showing the work that we have been doing for the last, well, since the last meeting. And well, I'll get directly to the next slide, which is the only slide in this talk. The basic observation is that the draft DNS over Quick has not changed in a while. I mean, we did an update recently to make sure that we are not kicked out of the draft repository, but apart from that, we didn't change anything. There are a couple of implementations that are available. We have not yet done actual interrupt testing through. The one thing that has changed, however, is that Quick itself is now past the IETF last call, and it's on the ISG deck for approval. So we should see, I mean, standardization of Quick progressing, which means that the draft becomes more relevant. I think that the draft is technically sound. It does what it does, which is carry a DNS request over Quick in a way that makes sense for Quick and makes sense for DNS. We did not have a whole lot of feedback, but I mean, which means that people are probably happy with the spec. It also may mean something else. I mean, the reason we did not have a whole lot of feedback may be that not many people care. And so I would actually like to test that and to see whether people will be willing to, I don't know, start prototype developments, try Quick in tools that do performance measurements, try Quick in other places to see whether it can be deployed in the infrastructure. We don't know whether there are some requirements about maybe in practice doing some tunneling or some proxying before hitting the server. So all that is feedback that we'll be very pleased to have. Otherwise, we could just also declare that we are done. I know that the remainder of this session will be discussing authoritative and using of encryption for traffic to authoritative. It may well be that DNS over Quick is a much better fit for the authoritative traffic than it is for the recursive traffic. The reason for that is that Quick allows for reuse of connection, allows for management of multiple streams, parallel things, etc., which are probably less overhead for a server than running TLS over TCP. I mean, you don't have to manage all those TCP connections you can do with a single UDP port, and that may be beneficial. But again, that's something I'd like to get the feedback of the group on there. And so that's pretty much my point. I mean, Do we have feedback, or should we say that we are done and just go for publication? Should we go as standard or experimental? That's the question.
Thanks, Christian. Peter, do you want to start off?
Yes, thanks, Christian. You say several implementations are available, but the draft does not have an implementation status section. And I think that would have to be very clear before we can say we are done.
Okay, so that's good feedback. We'll put the status of the implementation in a revision of the draft.
Thank you. That's all for me.
Ben?
Thank you.
Hi. I agree with your assessment. I think that there's I think DNS over Quick is much more interesting for recursive to authoritative. You know, we have good deployment feedback already for DNS over HTTP3 for stub to recursive. That seems to fit pretty well. So I think DNS over Quick is basically interesting, but there's kind of no deployment pressure yet, and maybe we'll see more deployment pressure once we have a story for recursive to authoritative. I think that based on the data tracker, it doesn't look like this draft has been adopted. So I would support adoption. I think that there's kind of no rush on it.
Technically, it is adopted.
Oh, okay. There just isn't a renamed version yet. Got it.
No, it is.
Well, okay, then this is just the tools site refusing to clarify the draft status or keep track of the links or something. Yeah, I think it's I think it's worth pursuing at least as experimental.
Thank you.
DKG? Daniel? Yeah, I hear. Yeah, it does sound like you're underwater a little bit. Okay, while Daniel figures out his mic world, that was some good feedback from Peter, actually.
Hello.
There you are. You're quiet, but you're there.
Okay, how about that?
Much
better, Daniel.
Analog issues. Christian, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on your server resources claim. So you mentioned that DNS over TLS requires the server to track a bunch of TCP state instead of UDP state. But I think the difference is really just about, at least for typical deployments, what happens in the kernel versus what happens in user space. Because it seems like there's still a comparable amount of state, maybe even more, that needs to be tracked in the DOQ scenario than in the DOT scenario. Maybe it just happens at a different part of the software stack. Do you have figures that show that there is less resource, that there are fewer resources consumed by tracking quick state as opposed to TCP state?
Well, the one thing from an implementation point of view is that if you have to manage just one UDP socket, it is simpler than managing one socket per TCP connection. So there is that, which is very clear. The state per quick connection in my implementation is about, I mean, I have done experimentation with H3, so I mean, it's not about directly the OQ, but the measurement on H3 is that with a single threaded server on an Intel i7 processor, I can easily manage 50,000 connections. So I think that's a good scaling.
I mean, that does definitely sound good. How many TCP connections can you handle on that with that same hardware? And does it just depend on what kernel you're using, or?
It's I was running on Windows there, but I mean we have the same measurements on Ubuntu. The point is that it's very easy to handle low activity connections. So I mean the overhead of handling a connection there is not very high. And you can also go into scaling by multiple threads and things like that if you want to. But I said, I mean, the actual, the state, the memory state is large. The memory state is about maybe 4K per connection because of all the security state and things like that. But overall, I mean, it's pretty easy to scale up a quick server.
Mr. Hoffman?
So responding to one or two messages in the chat where someone asked, are we talking about DNS, raw DNS over quick or DNS over HTTP3 over quick? And since this draft is very clearly about the former, and I don't see any reason to put HTTP3 in the middle there, based on what we learned from the Doe work. I can't see an advantage, and so I would, as this moves forward, I would like it to stay where it is now, which is raw DNS queries over quick transport. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
James?
I think that I think we really need public benchmark numbers comparing DNS over quick versus DNS over HTTP3. I think that will clarify whether or not this should be expanded to the stop to recursive or to other use cases that are outside of the current draft.
Yeah, I mean, clearly we need more benchmarks. That's something we can do. But I mean, I hesitate of doing too much benchmark if it's just, I mean, when you do benchmark, you always have so many variables that it makes much more sense to see that in the context of somebody's implementation, somebody's server. I mean, if I do a benchmark on a virtual machine that I just pick up from AWS, I mean, it will tell you something, but doesn't tell you all that much. From a code point of view, I can measure the overhead of doing H3. It is there. I mean, there is some overhead. I mean, the size of the queries is much larger. The size of the response is maybe 10% larger. But my main worry with doing H3 for this kind of application is that you bring all the complexities of the HTTP service. I mean, either you do a bespoke H3, and there are tiny H3 stack. I have one. I could do H3 with like 2,000 lines of code. but that means that you are doing something which is specifically designed for your server. And when people say, I want to run that on my web server, that's not what they mean. They mean, I want to run that on a Nginx or Apache or something like that. And that means that you are suddenly bringing all that body of code in your DNS server, and you are increasing the attack surface of that server by a whole lot. And I think that's a real reason for having a protocol is as minimal as possible, that it doesn't incite you to bring all that additional code in your DNS service with all the risk of having exploit of the codes, exploit of the web cookies, web fingerprinting, or anything like that. That's my real point there. That's why I'm not. I agree with Paul. I mean, it actually doesn't bring anything there.
Go ahead, Wes.
I was about to give up and just go. So I'm torn. I'll be honest, because I think DNS over Quick likely shows some promise over other things. But the IETF has notoriously had a difficult time with deploying, some protocol over multiple transports. In the end, typically one of them ends up kind of winning and living, and sometimes the others are actually removed. In some cases, we tried to state that one transport is mandatory because you need that common implementation that you can always fall back to. So in this case, it'd be one mandatory security transport, if we're trying to move away from over unencrypted UDP and TCP. And the rest become optional, and a lot of times the optionals don't actually end up getting used and implemented. So we're now at the point where we have, DNS over 3 potential secure transports, and without a good ability to pick between them, and whether and yet we may end up with 2 different transports between stub to recursive and recursive to authoritative, and I worry about the complexity of implementations. That being said, I want DNS over Quick on the table, hence the reason I'm torn, right? To be able to pick between them, but I do wonder in the long run, are we going to fall down to one that actually gets implemented, deployed, and becomes sort of the de facto standard of which one people use?
But in that case, we have one, so that's good.
Right, but how much work do we go through standardizing the rest and making them work and writing code around them, only then to rip them out later? It's a waste of. It would be nice if we had this big summary table of all of them with their perfect characteristics and benchmarks on every potential platform, and that's impossible, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Benjamin?
Hi. So, in terms of making progress on this draft, one thing that I'd like a little more thought on is the AXFR use case. So, the draft currently says no effort is made to support AXFR. It seems like supporting that kind of transfer should be straightforward as a protocol matter in DNS over Quick. And given the previous presentation on interest in doing that with DNS over TLS, I think it would be really good to have parity with between DNS over TLS and DNS over Quick, especially since we're talking about shifting the emphasis here toward recursive to authoritative. So where authoritative servers would be implementing DNS over Quick.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the reason we did not develop the scenario is because we are told not to do so at the time, because the charter of the group at the time said that we were not doing that yet.
Right. Dprive has rechartered, so this is
Yeah.
now in scope. I think it's worth. It may just be a small change to the text.
Well, I mean, my co-author Sarah is well aware of what it takes to do XOT, so I think she'll be very happy to add the text.
As for uses of DNS over HTTP3, I'll just note that I do think that there are substantial use cases where DNS over QUIC will not suffice and where DNS over HTTP3 is necessary. One deployed example that you can see now is NextDNS, which makes user accounts and uses HTTP account and path mechanisms to distinguish many thousands of different DNS servers on a single domain, potentially a single IP address, with different behaviors, policies, privacy settings, logs, that relies on the HTTP semantics. It would not be possible with any other transport. So I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't claim to know what the future of all these different use cases and transports is, but potentially there's a reason for each of them.
Sure. So, Brian and Tim, do I have some good guidelines on what to do next?
So
Well,
Christian,
definitely the implementation part. I think people want to see that.
Yes. I mean, I've heard two things. I mean, the implementation and also adding the AXFR support. I mean, basically compatibility, either by reference to the XOT draft or by adding some text or crossing the two. That we can certainly do that. Yes.
Yeah, Christian, I would suggest starting with the implementation information so that people can start doing some comparisons and testing, and then I think some of the AXFR functionality we can discuss as we kind of push the phase 2 work now and see how those two relate.
Okay. Okay. So we'll do that.
Great. Thanks, Christian.
You're welcome.
So is this getting into the phase 2 section of the meeting? Yep. So, and as Mr. Paul politely pointed out, there has been a bunch of conversation on the mailing list in the past couple of weeks, and a lot of discussion about opportunistic, which is something that's, has sort of come up. It's not in the phase 2 stuff, but there seems to be a lot of interest in that. And before I started kicking off on some of this, I wanted to see if any folks wanted to step up and sort of chat about opportunistic and why they feel it's better than what's going on here, et cetera, et cetera. And so, Paul, you may speak. I know you're dying to.
I'm not dying to. I'm confused. When you say it's better than what's going on here.
Well, more interested than what's going on in the phase 2 requirements discussion.
But the phase 2 requirements apply equally to opportunistic and fully authenticated. So I think that's a false dichotomy.
Okay.
And I made a few comments in the GitHub repo for the phase 2 stuff, but they were mostly editorial or asking for extensions. I don't see any competition at all there. I think that with the phase 2 requirements, once we have those down, that's orthogonal to the use cases of either opportunistic or forced authentication. I don't see anything
they
there.
can coexist is what. Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And in fact, I mean, because some people are very, very vocal about only wanting to do fully authenticated, anything that those of us who want to do opportunistic do has to coexist.
Yeah.
I don't think that there should be two tracks at all.
Okay. I can totally agree. Okay. My mistake. So, Peter?
I agree with what Paul said. I don't think opportunistic and pinned, authenticated, signaled, whatever, are competitors. So we've seen the same in email where people enable TLS on their MXs and people will just connect to that without any DANE records present, etc. Also, right now, we don't have any standards for signaling, pinning, authenticating, whatever. The one problem I have with opportunistic is that it might involve some probing on the resolver side. I don't like that. And the Paul's draft currently really skips over that. But bottom line, I think opportunistic and authenticated are two valid things that we should both pursue. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Sarah?
So I might have missed this. I guess one thing I'm interested in is I've seen the document on the use case for opportunistic and I've seen the requirements. Is it written down anywhere what we think we mean by full authentication? And by that I mean the details of aspects like, I mean, that's really a recursive decision and it will be dependent on what signaling information it gets. So is it the case we mean that if any one NS server for a zone advertises any secure protocol and no authenticated connection can be made, then the recursive must hard fail? And it's just a question of, is that an assumption everybody's making, or is that the policy around that written down? I've missed that.
I don't think it's fully written down, and maybe that's the part of the problem. Is there some assumptions there that looking at the requirements for the phase 2, you may be onto something there. So let's have Paul and Peter sort of chime in first.
Quick answer is no, it hasn't been written down. It is a lot of assumptions. Some of the people who have been, vehemently against opportunistic, who, and they're against it because they want fully authenticated, have made some assertions in things, but there's not a draft or anything like that. That would be useful because then we could see how well they could coexist.
Thanks, Paul. Peter?
The .pin draft is zone-centric instead of name-server-centric. So that one actually says you need to use a secure transport if that DS record is present. But if we look at the various TLSA proposals, none of which have been actually fleshed out, then Sarah's question is very valid.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
Water again.
And you'll want to speak up, sir.
Yep, thanks. I'm hoping I'm not underwater again. So it seems to me like we have 3 distinct cases here, thinking about what Sarah was considering. So one case is, there's 4 with the null case, right? The current null case is none of the recursives do any secure confidential transport to the authoritatives, right? The second one is a form of probing opportunistic transport. The third case is a signaled opportunistic transport, and the fourth case is the hard fail case that Sarah was describing, where there is a signal that indicates that the recursor should expect authoritative transport, sort of the STS, DNS STS, if you will, right? And so the question is, do we want to deal with all 3 of these variants, probing opportunistic, signaled opportunistic, and strict, or do we just want 2? If we just want 2, then the question is, do we want probing opportunistic, or do we want signaled opportunistic, right? So I think that's the way to break down the question that we're facing here, and I'd be curious to know if other folks in the working group have a preference in those broad categories. I'm setting aside what the signaling mechanism is, to be clear, and whether the signaling is done by zone or by server. Those are the sort of orthogonal questions.
Yep, that is. Okay, thanks. Sarah?
I agree with DKG's analysis. Initially, I would say keep it to 2 if we can, just keep it simple. I just wanted to throw in a couple of related comments while we're on the topic so they get captured, which is that if we're going to think about this from a recursive centric approach, which I think is what this part of the problem is, I think it's also interesting questions to ask about how recursives might describe their policies. And we should also remember that they may need to signal back to their clients why they failed. For example, with new extended error codes, because this seems very analogous to the DNSSEC case of upstream failures.
Okay. Benjamin?
Hey, Ben Schwartz. So DKG listed 4 different categories of behaviors. I think those are good categories, but I actually think this problem is kind of irreducibly complicated with a lot more interesting corner cases, like more axes that have interesting unavoidable knock-on effects, like distinctions in behavior between, okay, what if there's a signal that tells us that we're in the STS case, but that signal is in an unsigned zone, and there are multiple zones on this chain where that could potentially be true or false, and the implications of that signal being unauthenticated might even differ depending on at what point we learned it. There are also potentially differences in the security postures that recursive resolvers will adopt. So some recursive resolvers may be willing to implement a more strict profile, and some recursive resolvers may not be willing to tolerate any performance degradation, for example. And so I think there are something like 4 different axes, and to me there's like a dozen different cases here, and I don't see any way to simplify it. To me, my feeling is that we kind of should just like charge ahead, start prototyping, and explore this problem space with our hands.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm always for the charging ahead part. So, and yes, we're always going to have those corner cases, especially around zones and transfers, and DNS is just full of corner cases. That's really all it is. But no, and I think when we look at some of the phase 2 stuff, when we talk about requirements about authoritative domains, and I think Daniel had a good point about focusing on the cases without separating, without worrying about the name servers or the zones or how that's all managed, right? Because I think if you do the first one, then we can deal with sort of the set of issues that come up with, like you brought up, Ben, right? Where the security postures don't quite match, and we can sort of like work through those. I thought that was a good way of saying that. I tried to write that down. I'm sure Daniel's got it in a minute. So, but I thought that was a good way of approaching that, DKG. Is to split it up that way. And yes, I think it sounds like if we can keep it to 2, keep it simple to start off with, that's probably a great way to start prototyping. Right. So, okay. Did anyone else, looking at a lot of the comment, looking at a lot of the mailing lists, I wish Tony was here because he had done some work on this as well. But sadly he's not, because they had sort of put together a draft. And then of course in DNSOP we had the Mr. Fujiwara-san's draft, about the information signer bit, the new DIS record and stuff, which I brought up to Brian at the last minute, and he's like, oh. I said, we'll sort of talk about that. I thought that was very interesting work, and it may be relevant here, about how parents get delegation data, and and what's signed and what's not signed, and things of that nature. So, and I think when we even look at the phase 2 stuff, we only look at it's funny because we're talking about domains sort of at the the second level, but we're not looking at sort of where a domain has many subdomains, and it has different NS delegations, and how that all sort of plays out. And I think that will be a crazy place to go. So I think if we want to dig into these, then we can jump into like the list of requirements that looks like they've been broken down.
Yeah, so Tim, let me just kind of cover what I did with these slides, and people can bash me for them as much as they want. So what I did is I took the 11 requirements that were documented in section 5.1 of the requirements draft, and I put an ordering on them based on the discussions that I saw on the mailing list. So the ones that were seemed to be fairly popular in people's comments on the mailing list got moved up to the top of the list. But my expectation is that we're probably gonna be doing revisions of these as we cover other requirements. So it's not like it's going to be a final decision on this. It was just let's put an ordering to the way that we discussed them today, and then we can flesh those out as we go forward. The other thing that I'm going to say is that I know we're not going to get through all 11 today. My thought is that we could do an interim in January and an interim in February to keep working on these and keep the ball rolling forward, rather than letting things sit for 3 or 4 months in between meetings. So, my goal here is to get the working group actively looking at these requirements and making sure that we're identifying the right ones.
Okay.
So
Thanks,
off to
Brian.
you, Tim.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. I'm going to drop Daniel from the queue so he doesn't confuse me. So we'll kick off with the requirement 7, which is about authoritative domain owners. And this is sort of a long one, but this goes into the opportunistic, strict, what's being specified, and how these are being specified, basically. So must have the option to specify the secure transport preferences, and so any comments on this one? Because this one, I'm wondering, like, how should those things get published, et cetera, et cetera. That's where I think opportunistic becomes very interesting. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Ben.
So this is just to remind everybody that I have a draft proposal for how to express which protocols are supported. I'm not the only one who has such a proposal. There are a few. So the one that I wrote is called Service Bindings for DNS, SVCB for DNS, and it's currently named in the ADD working group. It is not adopted.
Ah, okay. Can you drop the link in the chat so I can go off searching for it? That would actually help me. So, Paul?
So I brought this one up on the mailing list, specifically the end part, which is, and it's just appeared in the chat now again. The idea that an authoritative server could say to a resolver, you must authenticate me or whatever. is sort of absurd, even in the case of authentication. That is, it's a preference. It's fine to say I would prefer that you ignore me if you can't authenticate me, but making any demand seems pretty over the top. In specific, because there will probably be multiple ways of authenticating. And so if, for example, a resolver who is trying to authenticate gets a positive authentication using one mechanism and a negative using another, what is it supposed to do with that demand? So I would like to see that latter part not necessarily dropped, but cranked down to being a requirement that an authoritative server might be able to suggest preferences. I also, on the list, I had said on the early part, well, you can just probe purports, and I agree with people who have said that has some problems. I think it's still doable, especially if there's a transport cache, but it seems likely that this requirement of there should be a deterministic way that is faster than waiting for a timeout on a port is a really good idea. Thank you.
Okay. Peter?
Benjamin mentioned he had a draft. Sorry.
Yep. Yes, he did.
Yeah. So I don't follow ADD because ADD is not about recursive to authoritative.
Yeah.
I still feel we have a separation problem between these three groups. I'm not sure what to suggest to fix it. Just want to observe that it's.
Oh, yeah, I agree. That's why I asked him to put the link in the chat, because I had not seen it myself, or I had seen it and missed it, sort of thing. Yeah. So I agree with you on that.
Okay, thanks.
So Daniel?
I just wanted to respond to Paul's comment in that, right, any announcement that I, as a server, would prefer you to connect to me over an encrypted channel is it's not enforceable. But it can be stated as a strong preference, right? It says, I'm not going to offer these services in the clear. If you find them in the clear, I'm making no guarantees about what you get because I don't offer them that way, right? We have this in HTTP. It's HSTS, right? It says, don't connect to me in clear text. I promise you I have the secure transport set up. Don't do it. And you could still do it, but it'll tell you, don't do it. We have it in MTA-STS. It says, when you send mail, and MTA-STS has a flag, right, that says enforce. It says, I promise you that Star TLS will be available, and I would prefer that you don't deliver until you've got the secure transport, right? And now, of course, it can't enforce that the client does that. The network operator can always, the network-based attacker can always offer clear text transport for any unwitting person, client that refuses to honor it. But I think it's still safe to say that this is a strict proposal, right? It's saying, I guarantee you the secure transport's available. You should use it. You shouldn't use anything else. And if we try to qualify it more than that, I think it's a mistake, right? That's the strict statement. It's like the enforce variant of MTA-STS. I mean, I think it's there's two things, right? One says I offer secure transport, and the other one says I would prefer that you enforce strict transport. Do not fall back to clear text.
No, that's good. And that's something we don't actually consider in the DNS world. If we don't have that secure transport, do you just reject the whole transfer? Which it sounds like that's what, and you're saying that's what you're saying, basically. I like that more strong
I'm not saying that that should be the case for every server,
everyone.
But I wouldn't want you to have to say that in order to stand up, DOQ authoritative, you must tell the world that they must that clear text transports are broken for you. I'm saying it's a simple Boolean switch that you can, as long as there's a signaling mechanism, you need to be able to say this, and I think you shouldn't try to connect to me in the clear. Obviously, there will still be clients that try to connect to your clear because they have no idea about the signaling mechanism. But for those that see it, you should be able to tell them, don't use clear text.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. Like your name server or for your zone, it's like this is your only option, basically, for example. So perfect. Okay.
Not saying this is your only option. That's not what the assertion is. The assertion is, if you can see this signal, don't connect to me in the clear.
Okay.
I can, as a server, I can never make it so that secure is your only option, because the network attacker can emulate the non-secure transport.
That's
right?
that's where I was trying to get in my head. Thank you. Okay. Apologies, Ralph. Unless Ben, are you still in the queue or did you finish up? Yep. Thanks. Okay. So Ralph.
Okay, so I mean, in DNS, having such kind of upgrade is always harder because the space that we have of different kind of actors that do stuff and operate stuff is much bigger. So if you have a signal preferred, I mean, the first thing is you have to understand the signal, but this will only happen shortly over time. And the other thing we have that I don't think is there in HTTP is if you have a signal for that domain that you only want to connect over a secure transport. However, either coming down the chain, there is something that requires insecure transport, or there is a name server out of a different domain that doesn't have the same secure transport. Then what do? I mean, there are lots of edge cases there that make it hard for the server to decide, if I see a secure transport, do I really need to take that as face value and then drop stuff, or shall I resolve it? And the other thing is, I mean, the people who are operating resolvers, you get a call if something doesn't resolve. And so on the operator side, it's often more important to give an answer than to not give an answer.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. Dwayne?
Thanks, Tim. We started off talking about requirement 7, right, which is focused on domains, zones signaling their preferences, and I feel like the discussion may have wandered off a little bit into server-based signaling, name server-based signaling. So I just want to make sure we're focused on the right thing here and clarify that we're talking about zones signaling their preferences rather than servers signaling their preferences.
Yeah. Okay. I feel that we are, but Ben?
Hey, so I actually want to argue against a bunch of these requirements. I think basically these requirements are too strict. They presuppose a bunch of aspects of the solution, and I'm not sure that I want a solution that actually meets all of these requirements. So, for example, requirement 7 says that the indication has to include a way to distinguish strict and non-strict descriptions. It's not clear to me that it's important to be able to express non-strict endpoints, especially given that non-strict endpoints can also just be discovered opportunistically over the network without indication. So while that's an interesting feature that we can talk about, I don't think it should be a mandatory requirement, and in this text it's expressed as a mandatory requirement. Similarly, requirement 9 says that a name server, that it effectively says that it must be possible for a name server to support use of secure transport protocol for one zone but not for another. Maybe I misunderstand the normative language here, but that also seems like an intriguing possibility, but not something that's crucial for us to support to declare success.
Dan, do you want to speak up? I have an answer for
Yeah,
mine.
sure. So I agree with Ben that these requirements seem a little bit strange to me. That they're not, they don't distinguish in some cases between whether the secure transport is expected to be opportunistic or not. Like requirement 9, I don't know why we care if a name server wants to offer opportunistic transport for a given zone. And I also don't know why requirement 7 does focus. Just speaking to the earlier point, I think it was Dwayne who said it, that the signaling needs to be per zone and not per server. Is that a decision that we've made collectively as a group? And if so, what's the justification for it? I'm not saying it's the wrong decision. I just think that I can see 3 different ways you could scope a signal if we're talking about how to do signaling, right? The 3 different ways that I can see are by the name of the name server, by the zone, and by the IP address of the name server. So I can imagine 3 different forms of signaling. There's probably more. I'm sure we're all clever people. We can come up with more than that. But those are the 3 that seem most reasonable to me. And I don't know why we would settle specifically on zone as opposed to the other 2. Maybe there's a good reason, but I don't know what it is.
So generally in the world of zone transfers, it's usually done, it's consenting parties with IP addresses and stuff, and names don't usually pop up in the sort of the conversation. And I think I saw that in the chat as well from, I think it was Peter.
Talking about zone transfers here, or are we talking about recursive to authoritative?
Oh, sorry. You're right. I got off on the transfer thing because, but yes. But I think also the name of the name server gets, that one's a little. It's an interesting one. I think zone and IP address, yes. But yes, and zone versus server. So I don't think we. Oh, so going back to your first thing, and Brian, you may want to speak up. I don't believe we've actually decided if we're doing it based on a zone or server kind of thing. I think when they started writing the document, that's what they sort of decided on, they picked. Alexander's here, so as one of the authors, so maybe he's got some comments on that. So Alexander, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Tim. Well, generally, I agree with them. With reading through the requirements that we have right now, they appear a little bit like misleading, and I think they don't reflect the original intent. And I think that what DKP said before is that he nailed it. Actually, we haven't yet decided whether what requirement 9 actually says is if to me, when a client sees that one zone that is hosted on a name server can be accessed by a secure transport protocol, is it safe to assume that all the other zones that are delegated to the name server can be accessed via the secure transport protocol as well? That's the point. And I think that what Daniel said before is very important, that we need to make a decision on that. So if the key to the transport capabilities of a certain name server, the zone, the name server, or the IP address. Yeah, and I think before we make up our mind on this, it doesn't make any sense to rehash those requirements. Yeah, but that's an architectural problem rather than a strict requirement definition problem. Yeah.
Okay, Peter.
Hello. Requirement 9 is a mistake. I have no other words for it. It prevents most opportunistic protocols we can imagine, and it complicates a lot of things. So I think it should just go. As for a zone or name server or IP focus, I don't think we can decide that today. For opportunistic, IP might make more sense. For something signaled per zone might make more sense. We shouldn't decide that today or put it as a hard thing in the requirements. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah. Sarah, you're welcome to go ahead.
I think I'm trying to formulate whether or not we have a non-requirement that all of the name servers for a given zone behave the same way in terms of their signaled transports. So we've just been talking about what happens on one name server, but the set of name servers do not have to offer the same transports. So question if I've understood that correctly.
No, you have. And I thought, and that's actually, you know, a fine question, right?
I don't think I remember seeing that in the document. I might be misremembering. That's why I was asking.
I think that's requirement 8. The authoritative domain owner must have the option to vary the preferences of a particular DNS zone that may be delegated to multiple parties, such as CDNs.
Right. Okay. So it's a requirement that it's not.
Yeah.
Not done. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So. So requirement 9, people seem to be pretty down on. Okay. And Daniel made a comment, and I'm gonna go back and read it because he makes much more sense than I do. He likes having 2 options: opportunistic by probing and signal strict mode. And those are actually that's 2 of your 4 basically.
Yeah. So the reason, the more we talk about this, the more I'm leaning in that direction. I hadn't made that list with the intention of advocating specifically for those 2, but here's why I'm thinking that. We're struggling right now with figuring out how to handle signaling, the scope of signaling, what the signaling is, all of that stuff, and that's a legitimate struggle. Like there are a bunch of smart people talking about this that disagree with each other here. I think that's an interesting struggle, but I think we can declare it sort of out of bounds if we're just talking about the opportunistic by probing model. Now, we need to have that struggle. We need to figure it out if we want signaling to be possible. But I don't see any reason why we would need the signaling to do opportunistic. So it seems like there's one track of work, which is guidance on how to do probing effectively. A bunch of folks in the chat have already identified a number of, real sort of pain in the ass things you have to do for probing, but hey, that's what you get, right?
Yeah.
So that's one channel of work. And the second channel of work is, if you wanted to do strict mode, like let's not repeat the mistakes of SMTP start TLS, right? Where we had start TLS for maybe decades before someone said, hey, we ought to figure out how to lock this thing on. So we can start that as an independent channel of work that says, how do we make sure that it's possible to lock this thing on, even if we know that most authoritative either servers or zones or whatever, however we scope that, aren't going to lock it on yet. We can do those work channels in parallel.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Ben?
Ben Schwartz. Paul is up next. He has smarter things to say, I suspect. But what I'd really like to see is an experimental draft that just specifies opportunistic by probing on port 853 and that specifies in great detail the state machine trickery and time constants and back off and all the rest that we think is likely going to make it work reasonably well. We can experiment with that. We can tune that while it's in progress, and then hopefully we can obsolete it once we have an actual signaling mechanism. Because opportunistic by probing probably is going to be less elegant than an opportunistic mechanism that makes use of some of the things we have yet to invent.
Paul?
So a couple of things here. One is I think people are using the term opportunistic incorrectly. And in my draft, I started off by referring to the RFC that defines opportunistic. Opportunistic means you should try to authenticate. If you fail to authenticate, don't break the connection. Keep going. But you try to authenticate in case there is value in authenticating. And one of the things we've seen in the last 2 weeks on the list is that some people have proposed value to authenticating. So a resolver that is doing opportunistic might get those advantages if it can authenticate. So people saying, oh, well, let's not do any of the more advanced things of like TLSA records. I think they're missing something on it that opportunistic folks might actually use that. The other thing is I cannot imagine that probing just by port number is going to end up being anything that people want to do exclusively long term. I think at least we will have something that is TLSA like or something in the domain name like or whatever. And there's no reason to, going back to what Ben just said, there's no reason to start with this and trying to figure out good timing and stuff, because as soon as we have the ability to do something with a DNS lookup where the responses, even with speed of light issues, are often under half a second, that's way less than most people would turn off their probes for. So really the big thing here is the transportation cache that I mentioned, that I said in the draft that I sent out today could be actually a separate document, because I think that's needed for both the fully authenticated case and the opportunistic case. And doing probes that don't expose anything, there's no reason, given that even an opportunistic resolver might not want to expose what it's the first query. And if it doesn't have to, that's great. So I don't want to go to just let's just look at port numbers and assume that that's going to be good enough. I would rather that we start doing some of the hard work that we've been doing this week and do that as a start for opportunistic as well. But at the same time, going back to Sarah's question from about half an hour ago, we also need to have an idea of exactly what the people who want to fail if they cannot authenticate, what they're going to do. That is like, and the example, I don't remember if she brought it up or someone else did, of, example.com has 2 name servers, one of which can be authenticated and the second one can't. For, that they've just screwed up their authentication somehow. So if a resolver that is doing strict goes to the second one first, does it fail immediately or does it try the first? If it tries both the first and the second and sees that it's only getting halvesies, does it say, well, that's fine, I'm always going to go to the one I authenticate? So we need sort of that kind of detail as well as we come up with things that would fall into requirement 7. We need to know the use cases. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Alexander?
Thanks, Paul, for that comment. I think what I've noticed in the last 20 minutes or half hour maybe is that the transport cache or however we should name it, the information that a resolver keeps about whether or not to connect to an authoritative server via secure transport, and it depends on a lot more dimensions that I initially thought. Because, for example, I think that if in case that the secure transport is authenticated with a host name, I think that it would be safe to assume that other zones that are delegated onto that same host name could be accessed by the same secure transport protocol as well, which is probably not necessarily the case if it's opportunistic, or let me put it that way, unauthenticated secure transport. So and as Paul said, it also affects other decisions because name servers already keep a lot of state about their authoritative name servers. So including availability information and whatever. So it could be just another factor in selecting a certain name server, and yeah, and then again, it's about what if the last name server that provides secure transport for a domain name fails? Would the resolver then return server fail, or would it rather go to an unsecured protocol? Yeah, so things like that. It has a lot of dimensions, and maybe we can make progress by sketching down those dimensions in the first place, and then investigate how they interact with each other. Or, as a couple of people have said, I'm also a big fan of like simply trying out things, yeah, and see where it goes. So maybe both things are an option, to do a hackathon in parallel to identifying those dimensions.
Yes, agreed. And Ben's idea of a narrowly scoped draft kind of really sort of sits well here if you sort of focus on opportunities by probing and then what's involved there, right? And if you look at like requirements 2 and 3, which are basically about how to determine whether servers, what's supported and how do you signal it, there's, that kind of digs into a bunch of that. If you're probing, then you can see it's a different sort of ballpark. So,
and the other part here, Tim, is that requirement 2 and 3, the way I read them, is implicitly stating that it's per server functionality, yes, and not per zone. And so the question of whether or not we're doing this per zone or per server is going to directly tie into whether or not these requirements even stay around.
Yeah, and actually, in part of some narrowly scoped draft should really kind of just see the, how are we going to address that, right? I think that's something, and there's lots of different pieces that go in there, right? You do it per zone, it allows you to be a little flexible, especially with requirement 8, where a zone is sitting on multiple different types of name servers, different vendors, different, et cetera, managed by different parties. So that, I think we'll have to sort of, we'll want to sort of make that decision, as well as the, and if I wrote down something here, per zone signaling versus per server signaling. And I think that kind of gets down to the other question of, are we letting people do it on a per zone basis or a per server basis? And I think there's pluses and minuses on both of those. I think, note that per server signaling might mean per name or per IP. Okay, I'll I agree with that. Yes. Server is sort of a broad term there. So I totally agree. But it sounds like also that requirement 7 is way too, I want to say this right. Ben made a point. It's too much. And that's kind of the note I sort of wrote down here in my window. And maybe it needs to be revisited, but you're correct. So and sort of sitting here thinking about this, thinking about the four cases, the opportunities by probing and signal strict mode. I think those are two very specific sort of experiments that can kind of go on, where people can, you can try stuff and see how that works. As well. And so, see, looking at the other, like 2 and 3 really do sort of tie together. Requirement 9, the feedback of sort of pushing off on that, sort of poorly done. Yes, because we haven't actually decided if it's per zone or per server. So requirement 9, go ahead, Paul.
I hear you struggling here with trying to get the wording right in from the
Yes.
current draft, and I think that that's probably not a good use at this point. I think that the folks who wrote the current draft, I mean, really, because the 0-1 had only minor changes and such like that. They started a year ago with a very different set of assumptions than what we're dealing with today. And so trying to shoehorn it into the current draft, I think is not a great idea. I think it's great for us to have a requirements draft, but I would say that let the authors of that take a look at what's happened on the mailing list in the last week, and maybe sort of and scrub and basically widen. But trying to do it on onesie twosie right now, I don't think is going to be
Yes,
really useful.
I agree, and that's what I was kind of looking at this, sort of saying, oh yes, mostly because the very big question of per server versus per zone, right? And the draft sort of goes back and forth almost in some ways, and I think that's a big question that I think we need to really get the working group to sort of nail down on. So that's what I feel. So others I may have gotten that wrong again, but so Sarah, go ahead.
Just something to throw into that mix while we're thinking about that. I've seen quite a few of the proposed solutions have a dependency on DNSSEC. So to be aware that whether or not that would create a coupling between different zones hosted on the same server if they all had to support DNSSEC, just for example. But I'm just saying that's another dimension in the solution space to consider that might feed back into this.
Okay. No, thanks. I actually hadn't heard the DNSSEC part. Go ahead, Peter.
So early 2019 in Prague, when Manu Bertel proposed DSPKI, my first reaction was people will hate this because it allows people to get some security while not doing DNSSEC. And then a year later, we proposed .pin, which also allows people to get some security in an unsigned zone as long as the parent is signed. But it turns out people don't hate that. And then later, Paul Hoffman pointed out, we need to keep in mind that many resolvers are not doing DNSSEC, yet it would be great if they got DOT or some other form of encryption. So I think I'm agreeing with Sarah that we should be careful in coupling these things in any way. But I also recognize that any firm signal would be hard without DNSSEC. Thanks.
No, agreed, and thank you. No, I understand this coupling. That DNSSEC people love. We love doing the DNSSEC stuff, and that's not always the place folks can go. I totally agree. No. Go ahead, Wes.
Oh, Peter's gone. Oh, right. So I will point out that we have one well-worked example of how to do opportunistic fallback from the best to the worst. And even so if you start with 7672, which is DNSSEC-based secured mail with authenticated records by the publishing side saying, you must do authentication to me, falling back to opportunistic encryption, even if you can't, falling back to SMTPS if you can't do that, falling back to straight SMTPS, straight SMTP. It's very late in the night for me, sorry. There's some well-worked examples of where we've actually done this in the past, and maybe one of the right things to do is to look at some of those models where that environment has been growing steadily for the past few years, and if we could emulate even that growth at all, then it's a sort of a major win in terms of both opportunistic and achieving sort of the best level of security as possible by achieving that level of opportunistic fallback.
Thanks, Wes. That's a good point. Paul?
Funny that you should say that. because one of the parts of that people here will probably really hate is the fact that one of the ways that authentication is done in the SMTP world, in fact, is not TLSA, but it is using CAs. And that a reasonable number of the SMTP servers out there that are doing TLS don't have TLSA records because it's a hassle for them or they don't know their DNS server operator, but they can get a cert. And the certs that they get are horrible. I mean, like PKIX people just like writhe when they see those. But in fact, CAs might have a part in this, especially if we aren't getting good authentication signaling because it requires DNSSEC validation or whatever. There may be a place in here for CAs that is not as gross and ugly as it is in the web or is wider used in the SMTP world. I see no reason to say it has to be done in the DNS, especially for the opportunistic case. In the opportunistic case where someone's willing to fall back anyways, letting them authenticate with a CA might be a reasonable way of getting any of the value of authentication. I certainly wouldn't suggest it as the only way to go, even if it turns out that we aren't, that we have too many edge cases with TLSA or its equivalent. But I think it could be thrown in the mix just in the same way it has in the SMTP world. And I say this as somebody who started the SMTP, TLS over SMTP. If you look, that's got my name on it from a bazillion years ago, and that's when we only had CAs. That was like a decade before the root was signed. So, thanks.
Okay, Ben.
So I agree with Paul that we should be open-minded about what the different roots of trust we might end up with are. I think that we're likely to find that there are some people in this ecosystem who won't touch the certificate authorities with a 10-foot pole, and there are some people in this ecosystem who won't touch DNSSEC with a 10-foot pole, and we're going to have to somehow get them all into one big happy family, and I think it is possible.
Yes. Oh, I agree. I think it is too.
But I wanted to focus in on this question of authentication from my perspective in the specific case where the client, which is to say the resolver, is willing to fall back or expects to fall back to clear text if connection fails. I don't think there is any use in any form of authentication. So I don't think that we even need to worry about authentication in that case. Authentication is only interesting if you will terminate the connection and not deliver the query if authentication fails.
Paul?
Then I might agree with you. That is, in fact, 2 weeks ago, I would have agreed with you. But on the list in the last couple of weeks, a couple of people have come up with reasons for authenticating that are not just, I absolutely want to guarantee that the communication was private and that there was no interloper. So I want to be open about that as well. Given that the definition of opportunistic includes trying to authenticate, if there's any value at all. In my previous draft, I said there wasn't. In the draft I put out today, I said, hey, there are some people who are talking about at least one case, which I don't know. And again, this is just stuff that's on the mailing list so far. But I don't want to go to the point of saying we know that there is no value to authenticating other than prevention of man in the middle. Some of the ideas seem okay to me.
Okay. Brian, what you just sent me, I think we should sort of bring up a little bit.
Okay. So, yeah, so Tim and I are having a sidebar conversation at the same time. What I'm getting out of this whole conversation is that we have a set of requirements in the document right now that I think for the most part have become a bit obsolete because some of the assumptions have gone by the wayside. And I'd be curious as to what the working group thinks of trying to turn this conversation into more of a what is it that we need to consider as we develop these requirements from the use scenarios, and try and get at some of the nitpicky details that we've covered today, like authentication per zone, authentication per server, regardless of how the server is identified, and really drill down on those types of discussions.
And take Daniel's four cases and, like he said, break it down maybe to two. Opportunities by probing or signal strict. Those are the two that we want to focus on and go down that road. And we should sort of hash that out too and see what the working group says. I think it was Sarah who even said keep it to two if possible, because that would make things simply, at least to start off with, as we start experimenting. So yeah, I think the more we look at some of this, the more we realize we've got to spin back and redo sort of how we were sort of approaching recursive to authoritative.
Alexander?
Thank you. I think that what I just thought is that maybe some of the experiments could even be on paper. Like we could identify, we have a name server that offers everything that it currently offers over port 53 UDP over a secure transport protocol that's unauthenticated. Let me put it that way. What does that mean? And play through a couple of use cases and scenarios, server failures, whatever, and see whether we get more insight from that. So we don't necessarily just need to write code. We can also think through a couple of scenarios. Yeah.
Correct. Okay, Puneet.
Hi, Puneet here. I'm speaking with my resolver hat on and listening to the discussion on the requirements, especially requirement 7. I think one thing I would like to note is that whether the transport is secure or not is really the server's server property, meaning multiple servers for a zone can independently be secure or not. So signaling that at the server level seems to make more sense, while the strictness requirement is really the requirement or preference of a zone owner, right? If someone's running a super secret website, they may want to say, do not connect to me, do not resolve names over an insecure transport, right? So I think for the requirement, I would split it that way. And the other thing with the strict requirement is, I think it's a little premature, as some other people have also mentioned, that we don't even have much secure transport right now. So to say we are going to make secure transport a strict requirement is, I think, a little premature. So we should leave it at the zone level for now, because that's practically going to be very few number of domains which can support it in the beginning.
Thanks, Praneet. Ben?
Hey, so I wanted to, Puneet and I have talked a lot about this topic. I wanted to argue with one point that Puneet just mentioned, which is that the strictness should be a preference, or might logically be a preference of the zone. So I think this goes back to our conversation of about an hour ago. In my view, the interesting thing to signal, the important thing to signal, is whether the whether the secure transport name server is reliable, is essentially backed by the full reliability guarantee of the name server operator. If the name server operator signals explicitly or implicitly, depending on our design, that the secure transport is reliable, then it is up to the recursive resolver whether to treat any failure as an attack.
Peter?
Yeah, it's very important. I agree that if you signal the availability of such a transport, that it is as reliable as your plaintext service, because otherwise you are back to probing in the hot path, which hurts. But besides that, I do think it should be possible for zone owners to signal that if the secure service is unavailable, it should be considered an attack. But also, as I mentioned in chat earlier, 2 weeks later, the resolver operator will ask for a config option to ignore that. So nothing is simple.
Go ahead, Puneet.
Sure. So I think to the reliable, the point about the service being reliable, I think the point to raise there is scalability, which is a concern off and on I've heard on private conversations, meaning UDP is of course cheap to run. If some operator turns up TLS, can we assume that it will be able to handle the same query load over the encrypted transport?
Yeah. So thanks. Yeah, and it kind of does sound like opportunistic by probing as a sort of a narrow scope thing is a place to start. And the strong signaling, I think people are still debating the per zone per server kind of discussion, and there's good arguments for that. And so maybe this is where the first interim goes, is sort of working out these scenarios. Though even before that, we should, we can sit down with the authors, the chairs, and sort of rework the requirements and sort of focus on a couple of these things. And yes, so I think as we sort of look at some of this, we realize these requirements are, have issues. And I think Paul's made comment earlier, like, when he told me to stop trying to shoehorn my thoughts into the requirements, it makes perfect sense, right? And that's, I think, what we're going to have to start thinking about. So, because you're right, requirement 9 just, it's just it makes things sort of messy. So I've decided to not try to shoehorn my thoughts into those requirements. That's probably a good way to go. So does anybody want to help lead some scenario developments, like especially this sort of narrow scoped, opportunistic by probing ideas? Mr. Paul.
I've got some drafts that I've been putting on the list already. I am happy to keep doing that. I'm happy to slice and dice them in ways that the working group might want. I'm happy if this is considered super early and not like, oh yeah, let's adopt this as a working group draft. I think that there's at least 5 different dimensions that we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. So saying let's make a working group draft seems sort of daft. But I'm totally happy to do it. I'm happy if somebody wants to do a completely different take on opportunistic, and we can see if we can mash them together, or if theirs is, easily better. I'm not wedded to being a document author. I'm wedded to the fact that I have for myself, just as a person, the use case of I would like to see more encryption happen there. So I'm happy to be active on it. I'm happy for people to throw stuff at me, suggestions, and I'm happy to churn through drafts fairly quickly. But having said that, I would like to see the work that's being done, especially that Tony Finch started, of looking at some of the signaling to keep going, not waiting for, let's see how it comes out with the unsignaled opportunistic. I'm 95% sure that what will come out is something where it will be a faster turnaround, and you'll get better information from one of the half dozen things that people have talked about today. So I don't want the working group to focus on opportunistic with port probing, even though that'll be something that I'm happy to work on.
So Paul, before you drop off, let me kind of tell you what I'm thinking here is that if we do 2 interim meetings between now and our virtual prog meeting, one could be focused on the opportunistic with probing, and the other one could be focused on whoever wants to lead a discussion on strict signaling. And in that way we can cover both of those cases as dedicated discussions and not have the working group bouncing back and forth between the two in one working session.
So I'm okay with that, other than your terminology of strict signaling, because in fact, signaling has 2 aspects. Do I, am I doing TLS? And what is a public key that you might look for or would expect? And I consider those to be 2 separate aspects. I think for example, just using the TLSA record as an example, a TLSA record that I can't use because I am not a validating resolver is still a signal for me that's a lot faster than port probing.
Oh, agreed. Yeah, my terminology is a little sloppy, but
well, I'm not being down on you for having sloppy terminology. All of us have had sloppy terminology in the last couple of weeks, and I think we're getting better now.
No, I agree. And do we have, it'd be good to see if we had some folks who wanted to lead some of the scenario type things. I know Alexander talked about sketching stuff out on paper, though I figure most people just want to go beat on some code and see how it sort of plays out. I figure we can go in either direction. And maybe that's an option before Prague as well, as we do some sort of mini hackathon once we get a few things sort of mashed out in our heads. Alexander?
Tim, I just want to clarify, I didn't mean that we should not write code. I just meant that more of the complex scenarios can maybe like thought through on paper equally well.
Yes. No, I agree. I didn't take it that way. So thanks.
So do we have any other points or comments that people want to bring up in the last few minutes of the session?
I know I'm going to have to go through and read the chat more carefully. And Mr. York, I know I'll probably end up going back through the minutes as well and listening to this again to sort of catch a lot of this stuff, because there's a lot of things that sort of went by me because I was doing a couple things. So thank you for doing that. Sarah?
I want to make a comment on a different topic just to see what folks think of it. So thinking about the threat model here, I noticed in the requirement document that the 2 motivations were around protecting the potential exposure of user data, and I think the other one was interference with the responses. I think there's a third consideration which could be added. I don't think it changes the requirements or the solution space, but it might also be worth mentioning that if you're thinking about zone owners who are interested in privacy and who already are actively trying to defeat enumeration of their zone, are likely to deploy ZOT, they might also well have an interest in encrypting as many queries as they can to their authoritative to prevent passive monitoring of those queries in exposing their zone contents. So perhaps if that can just be acknowledged in that requirements document, I think it would be helpful.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm making notes as we go. Thank you. So, and there's a lot of great comments in the chat. Folks like Ray and Daniel, and folks that have commented here, but also have been quiet, have made some good remarks there. So some of it's we're gonna have to sort of sift through. And so that's what I have to say. I've got to sort of rethink this, but this was good. The conversation in the mailing list in the past couple of weeks about the opportunistic bit, and I'm going to try it. We'll try to track down Tony and see about his draft and see where he wants to go with that, because I thought there was some, like Paul said, there's things there, and I'm just sorry he couldn't make it today. So we'll find him. Brian, any other final words? Because I think actually we're kind of close to the top of the hour.
Yeah, we're getting close to top of the hour, and I would say that what I would like to do is, as Tim said, get some people to volunteer to kind of do some of these scenario developments with the aim at having some interim meetings between now and our virtual prog meeting, which I believe is supposed to start like March 6th. So clearly we're gonna have to avoid the holidays in some way, but I think we can probably get it, at least 2, maybe 3 interim meetings in to have these in-depth discussions about these scenarios, so that we can start getting a little more focused on the recursive to authoritative requirements in solution space.
Yeah. So thanks. Yeah, and as always, throw stuff at the mailing list. Yell at us. We'll try to sit here and see if we can sort of make some headway on this. But this has been really good. It's kind of really done a good job to reset my thoughts here.
All right, with that, I think we're going to wrap up, and I hope everybody enjoyed their IETF 109 experience, and we will see you virtually in an interim meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks.